There are many different kinds of science. There are many different kinds of biology. There are also many different kinds of student. Here in the Cubic program at Florida International University, our aim is to expose each kind of student to every area of biology that they can. Why? So that when they choose whatever career path that they choose, it's an informed decision. It's something that they truly, really wanted to do. And how do they know that? They know that when they see before them the examples of what it means to find your true passion, how to encounter it in your life, and find a mechanism by which you explore it. We continue our journey on this, our second episode of Confluence, where life and science meet.
Hi, welcome to Confluence. My name is Adam Rosenblatt, and I'm here today with Dr. Mike Heithaus from Florida International University. He's an associate professor in the biology department, and he's also the director of the School of Environment, Arts, and Society. He's going to be talking with us today about his life and research. Welcome, Dr. Heithaus.
Thanks for having me.
And I'd like to use this time to get a sense of the course of your life and the different kinds of research you've done, the different kinds of positions that you've held, and how it's all sort of interweaves together. And so I think that we should start at the beginning with your early life and your first memories of interacting with animals. So can you tell us about anything you remember specifically?
Well, I pretty much grew up outside and interacting with animals. And my parents are both field biologists, and my dad worked on bats in Costa Rica. And so I actually had my first birthday in Costa Rica living in a tent. And so I even have flashing memories of peccaries, these pigs running in front that looked like they were 14 feet tall when you're that small, and even seeing sea turtles come up on the beach. But growing up in Ohio, my brother and I spent all our time outside digging through the log pile to catch these cute little ring-necked snakes that would kind of form rings around your fingers, or turning over rocks in the stream to catch crayfish. So we created pretty much a little zoo every summer in the house of different pill bugs and snakes and anything we could get our hands on, and just had to make sure they were back out before the snows started. And
Right.
Not too many escaped inside the house.
Didn't get in too much trouble for that.
No.
No. And as you said, you grew up in Ohio and were educated there, even went to college there. And of course, Ohio is a landlocked state except for the Great Lakes, but obviously no oceans around. Yet later in your life, you became very interested in marine biology. So can you tell us about how you got to that stage where you were interested in that area?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I always loved fishing, and some of my earliest memories are with a cane pole going to fish in Ohio and West Virginia. But I also loved watching shows about dolphins and marine life with Jacques Cousteau and National Geographic and David Attenborough. And so it was kind of that remote, weird world that you never saw that was so just enticing to me. And then even as I got into high school and beyond, going to SeaWorld and seeing these animals up close was really spectacular. And it was something that I'd kind of given up on at some level when I went to college, because I figured I'm in Ohio, nobody gets to go do that really neat stuff with those amazing animals. And so I started working on fish in the streams in Ohio and figured that would kind of be a neat way to go, because at least I was outside working with neat animals.
Right.
But then I went to a marine lab for the summer and got a chance to go on a course where I was out looking at dolphins, and just through some lucky breaks and taking advantage of opportunities, I got a chance to actually work with someone I'd seen on one of those TV shows. And now pretty much I'm living that dream that I had as a 5 or 6 year old kid that I never thought I'd be able to attain.
So really, it was these public science programs that sparked your interest, and these outreach things that got you excited about it.
Well, absolutely. I mean, a lot of it comes from being outside and having that kind of personal connection. And there's psychologists doing work on this that show that it's really important developmentally for kids to spend time outside. But that gets harder and harder. And so things like the TV and now the internet let us go to places we couldn't before and let us see that kind of magical and unique. And I think that that's something I'm really interested in, seeing how we can use that to get kids especially excited about this. And when you have so many options out there, how do we create that connection to nature? Because most people still have that kind of innate connection to animals and nature, and even if they don't become biologists, it's important to nurture that so that people care about the environment and animals, even when they're going to the grocery store and making decisions or casting a vote.
Right, or just hanging out in their backyard.
Exactly.
And then, so you went to college in Ohio, also Oberlin College, and somehow while you were at college, you ended up doing research on the other side of the world in Australia. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how that happened and what that experience was like for you.
Well, it was fantastic. And again, it was just through a series of fairly lucky events. After my sophomore year, I spent the summer in Beaufort, North Carolina, taking classes and going fishing at night, and I noticed dolphins kind of coming by somewhat regularly, and I thought, this might be a fun thing to do as a summer research project for an honors project in my junior year. And so I started to put together a project that I'd go back down and collect data on movements of dolphins, and was making as many contacts as I could. And I'd found, turns out, the National Marine Fisheries Service is not super excited about giving permits to 18-year-olds. And
I would imagine.
I was having some difficulties there, but in the course of reading the paper, the literature, and trying to design an experiment, I sent an email to a guy named R.H. DeFran, who was in California, and asked him about his special computer program to classify dorsal fins of dolphins, which is what we use to tell individuals apart. And he said,
right.
Microsoft Excel. And that didn't end up being super useful, but he did say, if you want to get into the field of marine mammals, you have to meet somebody, because so many people want to do this. You need to come to this conference and get to know somebody so you can move on in this field. And so I talked to a professor at Oberlin who had some travel money, and she helped me fly to this. And maybe more importantly was my swimming coach, because swimming was incredibly important to me. Swam all 4 years. And the weekend of this conference was against our biggest rival. And pretty much if I wasn't there, we didn't have a relay, so we were going to lose. And, my coach knew that this conference was coming up, and he said, if you stay, you can't come to the meet. I'm not going to let you swim. You need to go to this. And so he sacrificed, a team victory for me going out and growing as a person. And so, having somebody that cared that much about me as a person, and I keep in touch with him to this day, was really instrumental. So just those contacts I had got me to the conference, and then, talked to a few people and got the, everybody wants to be a marine biologist. And then I just found one guy Stephen Leatherwood, who was just one of the founders of marine mammal science. And he just, for some reason, took me under his wing and introduced me to people and told me who to meet. And one of the people I met was Richard Connor, and he was at University of Michigan at the time. And he's someone who'd been on TV a lot because of his groundbreaking work on the behavior of male dolphins. And so I talked to him about my ideas, and he gave me great advice. And when things were not looking like they'd work for North Carolina in the summer, I got an email from Richard saying, I can't really remember who you are. I think you're a master's student, but I found your email on the back of a napkin. Do you want to come to Australia and be my assistant? And I, of course, jumped at that opportunity. Even though I wouldn't be doing my own work, it was a chance to work with someone and really learn a ton.
Right.
And again, managed to get a grant from the college to help pay for my flight down there. And went down with Richard and found out when I got there that I had to teach him how to drive a stick shift car on the wrong side of the road as a 19-year-old, not knowing what I was doing, but very excited about it. And that really set the stage for my future career, because Richard and I worked together really well. And so he invited me to come back as a collaborator in the next year and not just as an assistant.
Right.
And while I was there, I met my eventual PhD supervisor, Larry Dill, and was able to talk to him about my interests and have that year and a half between graduating from Oberlin and going to graduate school to really figure out what I wanted to do. And that changed my entire life trajectory from probably going to a school to look at the genetics of streamfish to going and studying sharks and dolphins. And since then I've been lucky to find position after position and find a perfect place here at FIU to basically be able to make an entire career out of this.
All right, so really your introduction to the whole field was all through personal connections.
Absolutely.
As it always has to be, I guess.
I think at some level, yes. And, the personal connections aren't that hard to make. It's an email. It's, showing an interest in not just saying, I want to do this, but having learned enough about what other people are doing so they understand that you're interested in what they're doing, that you have a commitment to it beyond just, I want to go work with dolphins. And there is...
And you can talk about it intelligently with them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, you have to make your own opportunities and then be ready to take advantage of them. And, you do get brushed off a fair bit by people who are too busy to deal with undergraduates or whatever else. But, there are a lot of people out there who are really committed and really excited to help students, find their passion and be able to move on in the field. And it's something I really enjoy a lot now, and, to be able to give back and, pattern how I work after the people who really helped me out early in my career.
Yeah. And as you said, in Shark Bay, you initially started with a dolphin researcher doing dolphin research, and but eventually you switched for your PhD. You started focusing more on the tiger sharks, the top predators in the ecosystem. And I was wondering what was the sort of spark that made you switch from the prey to the predators?
Well, it was a couple things. The first thing I was really interested in was the dolphins and how they decided where to spend their time based on where their food was. Now, I knew sharks were out there, and there was that little spark in the back of the mind about, sharks would be really cool to work with. And I'd even done some preliminary work before I went down, and it's, again, another example of people being willing to help out. And I just went and visited a guy in California who worked on white sharks and said, how do you study sharks in case I have to do this sometime? And he put me in touch with a few people, and 3 emails later, I had an invitation to go out for a week on the Western Australian fisheries boat to see how they sampled, which eventually let me take their techniques, which were for destructive sampling, and turn it into the friendliest shark sampling we could do so that the animals were in good shape. But I'd started out on the dolphins and had this idea I might want to do sharks. And the first season I had was the winter, and measured the fish, measured the dolphins, and I was analyzing the data as I went along, which is another thing that's really a good idea, because if you get yourself a pile at the end, you spend 2 years digging through it and you don't know what's going on. And by analyzing those data as I went along, I was able to adapt what I was doing to the system, because in the winter, there were 3 times as many fish in the shallows as the deep. That's where all the dolphins were, and it perfectly matched the predictions. And young PhD students like, I got this figured out. Then it got warmer. The fish were still all in the shallows, and there were no dolphins there.
Right.
And I had no clue what was going on. So obviously that whole idea that it's just about food was thrown out the window. But as I was going and doing the work on the dolphins, I'd really noticed that a lot of the dolphins had these big scars and bites out of them. And so that said, okay, sharks probably are fairly important here. And then that led me to working on the sharks. And then after about a year or so of working on the sharks and seeing that the sharks weren't there in the winter, they were there in the summer, and that was pretty tightly correlated to the behavior of the dolphins, I said, wait, what other species might these sharks be influencing? Because the sharks obviously aren't just eating dolphins, or there'd be no dolphins left because there's so many sharks there. And so that led to this whole ecosystem approach. And then the next real step was being recruited to Mote Marine Lab in Florida after I finished my PhD to work in a supposedly pristine system. And I went there and there were no bloody sharks.
Right.
And so I said, well, that really drew my attention to how special of a place I'd been working in Australia, and some of the major challenges facing top predators like sharks, which has kind of changed the whole trajectory in Shark Bay to really focusing on how important are sharks and using that as a model for how we need to work in, restore, and protect coastal systems around the world.
Right. And also after your PhD, you did something very interesting, which is that you had a short stint as the host of your own show called Critter Cam on the National Geographic Channel. And can you tell us about how that opportunity first of all came about, and also what it was like to work in front of the camera, because it must have been very different than doing your PhD research.
Just a little different. So again, the opportunity came up because I sent an email, and I'd been to the marine mammal conferences at National Geographic. A guy named Greg Marshall had invented something called the Critter Cam. It's basically a camera you put on an animal with some environmental sensors on it. And they'd been working with some biologists who studied seals and had done a couple deployments here and there to do TV shows. And I realized when I was working with the sharks that we needed some way to track the sharks and then to see actually where they were, because the tracks, you don't know exactly where the animal is. Is it up on the bank or out in the deep water?
Right.
And so I contacted them. Greg and his wife Birgit came down, and they didn't believe we'd catch sharks because they just spent 6 months in South Africa and hadn't seen a shark. We caught 4 in a week, 4 sharks to track in 1 week. And so they got the idea they wanted to do a special on tiger sharks. And they got that approved to do a 1-hour TV show on tiger sharks and did half of it in Australia. And as this was going on, I said, look, here's the deal. I can't just have a couple cameras to throw out and just have some nice video. That's great. I said, you have to train me how to actually use these systems, how to fix them and run them, because each one is a monstrosity of electronics at the time, and each one was its own new version.
Right.
And so they agreed to that, so I could have the cameras the whole time I was in the field. And so they came and filmed us. I did my research, went on to Mote Marine Lab as a postdoc, and then I'd been doing that for about a year and got a phone call that they wanted me to come up to Geographic to help them enhance the scientific applications of the cameras. And the idea is I would go out and help other people put the cameras on the animals they worked with.
Right.
And oh, by the way, could you host a show for us? And then the second was, oh, and do you know anyone who might want to film this show that we don't have to pay a lot of money? And so I called a friend of mine who had been an assistant in Shark Bay that I knew wanted to be a natural history filmmaker and had never used a camera before. But he had just bought one. And so they agreed to bring him on. And so the two of us basically, within a couple weeks, were sent to the middle of nowhere Hawaiian Islands, in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands, and said, come back with a show about monk seals or else.
Wow.
And so we did the work with the scientists at NOAA, Frank Parrish, filmed about 55 hours of video for a half-hour show, which made editors insane, and ended up doing a 13-part series. And the reason I mentioned Pat especially is that the two of us have continued to work together through time, and he now has his own production company, and we've developed new video methods for getting science out to kids. So again, these contacts you make early in your life,
Right.
and the relationships you cultivate can make a really big difference in what you can do as you move through your career.
Right. And after
It's
having
a lot more fun too.
yeah, of course. And after having your own show and doing all this kind of broad outreach activities, you decided to come back to academia. Why'd you make that decision?
Well, TV was something I never really thought I would do. My parents were professors, so that was kind of always what I wanted to do. I wanted to be able to study the animals, and I like to get to know systems in more depth. And with TV, you go here, you go there, you see really great things. I got to work with some fantastic scientists, but I really was passionate about keeping the project in Shark Bay going, growing it, because I knew there was a really important place for that in terms of marine ecology.
Right.
And coming to FIU was really the perfect place for me, because it's the kind of school I wanted to be at. I wanted to be at a public school where I could do my research and be working with a diverse group of students. And so I've got that desire to make the biggest impact that I can. And I thought that really was in academics and not in TV, which is a very fickle business. And you're great 1 minute and the next they're turning to the next person. So by coming here, I've really been able to do the best of pretty much everything, which is do the teaching and the research that I am very passionate about, and then take the skill set I learned in terms of being in front of the camera and creating compelling stories to do new things with the media the medium that I couldn't have done at National Geographic. And we have control over the content, so we can always get it right and not have to sensationalize it for the camera or gruesomize it.
Right. And as you've said, you're really interested in making public science education available to everybody, and you can do that a lot here at FIU. And I'm wondering why you think it's important for people to learn about biology in general and just have a basic knowledge of it, and also why learning specifically about animal behavior is important for people.
Well, I think I'd start actually with a broader, just understanding basics about the environment we live in. And you see this when you hear political talk that the economy is the top issue, and that's obvious why that is. I mean, that's a very immediate concern, but the economy is really a subset of the environment because all our economics and systems are based ultimately on environmental systems.
Right.
So it's really important that people understand and care about these because really, that's a selfish thing. Protecting the environment, making sure that we balance the uses for people with environmental integrity is really important for our own sustainability and our own well-being into the future, and ensuring that we're leaving for the next generation a place that's better than we got rather than one that's worse.
Right.
And animals are a great way to get into this because people tend to have an emotional attachment to it, and I think that that's one of the reasons that it's an area that I like to work in, and it's my particular area of expertise, so it's one that I can get excited about and portray to the public. And
right.
Animal behavior is a very important part of what animals do and really influences their role in the ecosystems. And also, from a public perception standpoint, it also kind of helps us identify with animals because
right.
you don't want to anthropomorphize animals, but a lot of the decisions they make are very similar to the way that we make decisions, and so you can kind of relate to what they're doing, the plight, and or just get to the point where you're caring about them enough that you want to protect them.
Right. And speaking of the differences between animals and humans, or
we are animals.
I know animals as humans, humans as animals, or just the differences between species. You have studied lots of different kinds of predators in your career, and I'm wondering if you found that there are commonalities between most of the predators you've studied in terms of how you study them and gain knowledge about them, or is each type of species that you study a unique challenge that you have to come up and basically start from square one?
Well, you never really have to start from square one because there have been a lot of great people who have come before. Mm-hmm. And I've found it actually fairly easy to move between the different predators we've worked with by making the right connections and the right collaborations.
Right.
And the commonalities are the kinds of questions that are important. What drives their behavior, whether it's factors in the physical environment, food, their own predators, reproduction. So those questions tend to be fairly similar with their own different flavor across systems. And then how you work with them, that's kind of the engineering challenge
right.
that's exciting and interesting. But, it's really not that much of an impediment if you get right down to it.
Right. And can you tell us about your research and career plans for the future?
I almost hate to make plans for the future because I seem to go in very different directions every time I think I've got a plan. I mean, for example, taking over as the director of the School of Environment, Arts, and Society and Administration was something I never would have thought I would do.
That wasn't part of your master plan?
It was never part of the master plan. But, it's an exciting challenge because I can really help other people from students to faculty and make those links to the community. So it's a unique challenge. But, I really see my research continuing in Shark Bay, hopefully seeing some of the students who've come through the lab and are starting their own careers, taking on more and more of that and really building their careers. I see the work in the Everglades and here in South Florida continuing to grow. Again, probably more as a facilitator as much as the person out front. And I think that's a natural progression, and I get just as excited. I love to be out there doing the stuff in the field, but it's just as exciting for me to see other people and help them start projects and flourish. And I probably see myself doing more and more actually in the communicating science to kids and the public because I think that's one area where I've been lucky enough to get a skill set that other people haven't had the fortune to get, and it's exciting to be kind of working on that new boundary of how do we communicate, and maybe it's a style that will be picked up by other people in other places so that we can get kids really excited about it. Because when you take video, but not just video that talks at kids, but actively involves them and gives them activities where they have to be thinking and doing, they get really excited about it and they really remember it afterwards, and that's what's important.
Right. And lastly, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the most interesting or intense interaction that you've ever had with an animal. So do any specific interactions stand out to you?
Yeah, most of my, I guess on the intense side, Alaska features very heavily. I worked on both humpback whales and helped out with a study on grizzly bears. And the humpback whales, when you've got animals that are 45 or 50 feet long, that are coming up to the surface, they blow these big rings of bubbles to get herring trapped inside, and then they all come flying up through, and you're out there in a little boat, little rubber boat basically, with the camera on a big pole, and you need to put the suction cup on the whale. And when all of a sudden the ring gets blown around the boat, and you see these gaping maws kind of coming up. It's pretty intense. Or when you have to duck under the flukes.
Did your boat get like in the mouth of a whale?
We did not get in the mouth, but we were lifted once and kind of.
Oh my God,
So
that's crazy.
it is. We definitely had one that came up right next to it. I mean, they're very small esophagus, so they aren't, even a salmon they kind of choke on and have, so the boat would have been a problem, but still, it's pretty.
So saying if you had
impressive.
fallen into a humpback whale's mouth, you could have gotten out.
I could have gotten out. I would have had to hold my breath for quite a while.
Like Pinocchio.
Yes, but when we were working with grizzly bears, we did have one situation where it was about 9 o'clock at night in the summer, and the light was very low. We're in this stream bed; it's pouring rain. The streams were very high relative to normal, so the bears were having trouble getting the salmon, and we were walking out, and all of a sudden I just heard this crashing sound, and I was holding the tranquilizer gun with no tranquilizer in it,
Of course.
and no tranquilizer anywhere on my body. And the bear was coming pretty much straight at me, but luckily got deflected.
How far away was it?
Probably further than it seemed. It felt like it was about 6 feet away, but it was probably about 12. But it was just flying down this bank, and I turned around and took one step back, and the bank I was on collapsed, and so I ended up to my neck just about in the river. And it got deflected and toward the wildlife biologist who'd been working with us, and he's been working with grizzlies for 30 years, and everyone has a rifle that is competent and trained to have a rifle. But he didn't want to try to shoot at the bear, and so he tried to scare it away. But then as it came up to him, he actually was getting his backpack off to try to bring the gun around, and he fell down, and that saved his life because his leg came up and the bear grabbed his leg, and he had to shoot the bear off his leg.
Wow.
So and I mean, it's the most intense, and it's also the worst thing I've ever been a part of as a biologist because, nobody wanted to have to shoot a bear. And, this guy most of all, he was in tears having to, crawl over to it. And I mean, that was pretty bad because, we're out there to protect these animals and help them. But, it does remind you, these are big predators and you really have to be careful and respect them. And we see this. It's one thing I do worry about is, now with sharks, we've got people trying to swim around out of cages and say they're not killing
Right.
machines. Just
Right.
look, we could swim. They're not trying to eat us, and they're not mindless killing machines. Most of the time, you're going to ignore you, but you don't get out of the Jeep and walk across the savannah to pet the lion.
Right.
And it's the same thing. So I worry that sometimes we don't have for some reason we don't have enough respect if an animal could take us out. It doesn't mean we have to prove they can't.
Right.
And I guess that was the other exhilarating moment was working with lions in Kenya where we were putting collars on the lions and also working on a study or helping with a biologist who's working on a virus a lot like HIV
In lions?
In lions. It's a feline virus. And he had darted one lion, and apparently the dart hit the connective tissue, and so it got a dose of one of the drugs but not the other. So we were pulling this lion out from under a branch, and it roared. And I have never run so fast in my life. And that one, luckily, it basically couldn't move, but it could roar, and that was
enough.
terrifying.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you've had some pretty interesting experiences.
Luckily, for the amount of time I have spent in the field, we have avoided intense experiences, but there are too many exciting and amazing experiences to even really talk about. It's just spectacular stuff out there, and the more time you spend in the field, the more amazing things you see. And going to Shark Bay since 1994, and every time I go out on the water, I am just as excited as I was the first time because you never know what you're going to see, and you almost always see something new and exciting.
Right. You got to keep that childlike sense of fascination.
Yes, I'm told often that I'm still like a child.
I wasn't implying anything.
I am.
Well, that's great. Thanks for spending your time here with us today, and I wish you all the success in your future work.
Thanks a lot for having me.
And now we have some time for questions from the audience.
As a student, as an undergraduate in college, how are you able to balance out your regular schoolwork with all the traveling and all the extra, added pressure?
Well, I was pretty lucky in that, my first couple years, I didn't have a whole lot I had to balance. I was just focused really on the coursework. You know, first 2 years, I had a plan of what classes I needed to take so I could get to the fun stuff in the upper division. And, you know, had maybe started to talk to professors about opportunities, but hadn't really started to do much. And then I used my summers to go out and do something. After my freshman year, I went and made money as a lifeguard in an indoor pool with a lot of screaming kids. But then after my sophomore year, I went to a marine lab to get experience. And then after my junior year, I had the opportunity to go to Australia. So for me, the balancing act was really schoolwork and swimming and all the athletic stuff. But, you know, it really comes down to having to compartmentalize the time that you've got in planning, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Did you ever have any doubt as in your college career advanced as to what career you wanted to undertake?
You know, I'm probably one of the few people that knew exactly what they wanted to do, mainly because I'd seen my parents grow up as faculty members. So I kind of knew that was what I wanted to do. And really the getting derailed into, well, what do I really want to do when I grow up happened after I graduated and went to graduate school and had this opportunity to go for the television route versus academics and becoming a professor again. So I think we all go through it at some point in time, and it was just a matter of trying to figure out what would be for me the best long term. And yeah, TV's great, but I really wanted to be in a situation where I could have a stable job, stable family, and you know, seeing what the TV industry does to people in their personal lives, it wasn't really what I wanted to do. And so, you know, I think that, you know, I was lucky, but a lot of people try to experiment with a lot of things. In graduate school, I think everyone I went to changed their project 2 or 3 different times, and that's fine. And I think it's better to get to where you want to be instead of trying to get somewhere fast. And so, I mean, if you can, experience lots of different things, and you really never know what's going to spark your interest. Actually, my first assistant I had when I was a graduate student also had been an undergraduate at Oberlin College, but was an English major. And he came out in the field and spent one semester out in the field with me, and now he's a biologist because he decided that's what he was passionate about instead of just a fun thing to do in the summer. So I think that, you know, experience a lot of things and figure out what you're really passionate about and want to do.
Thank you.
Shark bait is called shark bait, not tiger bait. Tiger shark bait. Does that mean there are other sharks besides tiger sharks?
Yeah, actually, shark bait was named for really small sharks. There's a shark there called the nervous shark. They're called nervous because every time you walk into, they swim next to the water, and if you walk into the water, they panic and swim away. And you get these big schools of nervous sharks that the early French explorers saw and named it Shark Bay after those. But there are certainly enough tiger sharks to be named Tiger Shark Bay, because if you look at the sharks over 6 feet long, about 90% of what you see there is tiger sharks, maybe 95%. And our average shark there is about 10 feet long. So we get them up to 15. Don't get too many that are below 6 feet. The little ones are somewhere else, but not where the adults are. Probably because if an adult saw a little tiger shark, they'd eat it.
Snack time.
Yes.
So they're like the top shark in the area. That's why you focus on them and not the other ones.
That's right. Yeah, that's 2 reasons. One is that they are the top predator, and especially because they're the only species in the bay that can attack the dugongs and the dolphins and the turtles, which are other species that we think might be really important. So because they can attack and scare the animals that are feeding on the seagrass and might change where the seagrass is, that was why we focused on the tiger sharks. Now, we're starting to get more interested in the smaller sharks because those smaller sharks need to stay away from the tiger sharks, but then they're pretty big, scary predators if you're a fish. So as we try to understand the importance of the small fish, we need to know about the other sharks as well. So, you know, we've started focusing out on a couple species, and we just keep expanding that and expanding that. And, you know, that's one of the exciting things, is that there are always more interesting questions to ask while we're down there.
So you said they attack the other animals in the area. Does that mean they eat them as well, like dolphins, or they just fight them?
Oh, if they get their mouth on them and can, they'll eat them. A lot of the dolphins actually get away, and this is one of the neat hypotheses that have been put out there, is that the blubber in some of these warm water dolphins seems thicker than they need to stay warm, and it might be that it's partially like really soft body armor, is that a shark bites onto that and the dolphin can twist away, and it might tear up the blubber, but that heals really, really fast. And dolphin survives and swims away instead of if they didn't have a big blubber layer, they might get killed. And so you see a lot of dolphins, but just that little bit of blubber, that's a good meal for a shark. That's super fat, tasty meal. So yeah, that's enough. But if they kill the dolphin, they will eat it.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for spending your time with us today, Dr. Heithaus.
My pleasure.
And we'll see you next time on Confluence.